Well, good morning. It was the fall semester of sixth grade, and I was just voted by my entire class to be the president of our student council. This was a big deal. My entire student body, or class, had just voted that I was going to be the president. You see, at my elementary school, student council was a group of 10 sixth graders who got the opportunity to lead spirit days at our school for the semester. So me as the president, it was my job to make sure we were all doing the right thing, that we were going the right direction, and that things were going well. Can you hear me now? All right. So back to my story. So I'm in student council. I'm the president. I'm in sixth grade. I am leading this group. We are heading towards planning these spirit days. And so my week as president was really, really busy. You see, on Wednesdays, I would begin my day with a meeting with the principal. Every Wednesday, I met with the principal, and we talked about what we wanted to do. We would get his permission to do certain events, and then we would get his direction on if there was anything he needed us to do. And then after my meeting with the principal, I would head to student council, where I would tell all of the students what I had just talked about with the principal. I would kind of report what we had learned about. I would share that with them. And then, after we had our meeting, we would go to all the classrooms in the school and tell them what we had just talked about. So basically, I was just telling people everything I talked about with the principal all day. As you can see, Wednesdays for me were pretty busy with all these meetings. But I loved being part of this student council. I loved being on this team. I loved the energy and the excitement of what this brought. And as I think back to my time as the president of student council, I don't remember that we did anything significant. We did not change the school. We had like one or two events. We maybe had a fundraiser. We didn't do anything world-shaking. What does stick out to me from being on student council, though, is what student council did to me. See, being the president in sixth grade was the first time in my life I remember holding power. The first time in my life I remember having influence over people. The first time I remember that I could direct the way in which something was going. I was the president. I had the opportunity to meet with the principal. I got to lead the meetings. I got to bang this little plastic gavel. It was me. And I felt like I was doing something really, really important. And so I liked it. I liked what this title, this opportunity gave me. So I want to flip the question to you now. When was the first time you remember experiencing power? What was that like in your life? Was it when you were voted captain or you were voted the leader of your team? Was it when you were promoted to a new role or a new manager or you got that new title at your job? Was it when you became a babysitter or you were invited to lead the Sunday school group or the small group? When did you experience power? Because if I had to guess, most of us have experiences with power. We've experienced this power, and we found that it's kind of nice. We like it. It feels good to have power. It feels good to direct and organize and lead things. It's fun. And this quest for power, this quest for establishing and maintaining and holding the power that we have, I think is within all of us. And it's also the driving question that I see in the text that we're going to look at today. We're going to talk about power, we're going to talk about what it means, we're going to talk about what it looks like. Before we jump into that, though, I just want to introduce the series. If you're new here, if you haven't been with us, we are in this series called Acts, Community, and the Gospel. We're spending the bulk of our summer in this, looking at what this book of Acts can teach us about being in community and about sharing the good news with one another. You may also notice that we've got some really awesome decorations on our stage. And I want to do my best today to bring VBS to you guys. So we're going to try and use some of these props as well today. So stay engaged, lean in. We're going to have a little bit of fun as well. So if you want to open up your Bibles, we're going to be in Acts chapter 12, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 25, kind of the whole chapter today. So we're going to start in verses 1. We're going to move forward kind of a chunk at a time. So if you want to move to Acts chapter 12, I'm going to start with reading verses 1 through 4 today. And the question that's going to guide our reading today, the question that we're going to keep asking again and again and again as we're looking in this text, is what do you do when you need power? That's the question that I'm going to ask you multiple times today. That's the question that's going to come back up. So keep that on the front of your mind as we continue to read. So starting in verse 1. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the festival of unleavened bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So when we read this, there's actually a ton that's going on behind the scenes that we don't get to kind of catch on the first reading. But as we read this, we feel like we're just kind of dropped into this story, right? We're dropped into the middle of the action, and we meet this guy named King Herod. Is anybody familiar with the guy named King Herod? Anybody remember this guy's name? So if you are familiar with the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, they begin talking about the birth of Jesus, and they mention a guy named King Herod. And King Herod in Matthew and in Luke is really scared about the birth of this so-called Messiah. And so what he decides to do is he is going to issue an order where all the baby boys under the age of 2 are killed. So that particular King Herod in Matthew and Luke would have been Herod the First, Herod the Great. And we can read about him only in Matthew and Luke. When we get to Acts here, the one that we're reading, this is actually his grandson called Herod Agrippa. But Luke is really intentional. He gives him the same name. He calls them both King Herod, and he's doing this so that our minds remember how bad the first King Herod was, and we know that this new King Herod is also bad news. So when you read about King Herod in Acts, this is a different King Herod. This is Herod Agrippa, but he's just as bad as the first one, and that's kind of a first clue in for us as we're studying today. Back in the text, we see that Herod Agrippa, King Herod, has decided to arrest and execute James and arrest Peter. And these both were leaders and apostles of the early church movement. By doing this, Herod is participating in the persecution that we've been reading about the last couple weeks. But it brings us to the question, why exactly is he doing this? Why would he kill James and arrest Peter? Well, that draws us back to that question I asked us at the very beginning. What do you do when you need power? You see, Herod is not in a good spot in his leadership. The people above him are questioning if he has the right to rule. You see, he's been given this area of the world to be ruler over, but he hasn't been doing a very good job. This area has been riddled with instability and unrest. There's uprisings. It's not been peaceful. And so people are starting to wonder if this is the right guy for the job. They're wondering if Herod deserves to rule over this land, or if it should go to somebody else. And so in order for Herod to keep his power and authority over this particular area he's ruling, he needs to start doing something to prove that he's trustworthy of being a ruler in Rome. People above him are starting to question his leadership, and it's time for him to prove his worth. So how exactly is Herod going to do this? He decides what he's going to do is simply do what the people around him think is a good idea. He's going to use a tactic we call appeasement, where he's going to give in to the desires and the demands of the people around him and below him, in hopes that the people above him don't hear any complaints. And so to do that, Herod decides he's going to align his interests with those, the religious leaders, around this area, particularly the Pharisees. If you remember from the book of Acts, the Pharisees have been irritated and upset and annoyed about one thing in particular, and that one thing is Jesus and his followers. That's been one of the central themes we've been following in this book of Acts, and that's what brings Herod into this story. The movement of Jesus is growing, and the Pharisees need this thing to stop. And in their mind, the easiest way to do that is to take out the leaders. And so they convince and persuade Herod that this is the next logical step. And so that's how we find ourselves in this point at the beginning of this chapter. We find ourselves where James is killed, where Peter is thrown in jail. It's not because King Herod has anything against them. It's just because they're particularly pawns in somebody else's story. Pawns. But amidst the execution of this plan, there's a twist that the text throws in. Herod can't follow through and execute Peter yet. He has to wait on Peter on his trial, because the festival of unleavened bread, or the Passover festival, is occurring at the same time. And so if Herod is to execute Peter right now, he's going to tarnish that relationship he's working so hard to build between him and the Pharisees. And so Herod needs to wait until this festival is over. I want to bring us back to our question, what do you do when you need power? Herod's answer in this moment is the best way that he can gain power is through appeasement. Through listening to the desires and the wishes of the Pharisees around him. He's hoping that's going to be able to help him hold on to the power that he has. From an outside perspective, though, I want to ask the follow-up question to this. Is that really power? When your power rests on the people below you, not saying anything to the people above you, is there really any power in that? From an outside perspective, I don't think so. I don't think that's much power at all. I think that's pretty silly in a lot of ways. And I think we can see that right in the world around us, but I want us to zoom in. I also think we can do that spiritually. I think there's sometimes we might treat our relationship with God in a similar way. What is it that we do when we need God's power? Maybe we need God to move, and so we decide we're going to jump back into church. We're going to join 6 groups this quarter. Maybe we need God to answer that prayer, and so instead of reading one Bible study or one Bible passage, we jump in with 3 or 4, or we go to this new thing, or we keep adding all this stuff. What do we do when we need power? You see, those things aren't bad, but sometimes I have to wonder, what's the motivation behind them? Are we doing all these things? Are we adding all these stuff? Are we seeking after God in these new ways in order to align ourselves with him, in order to experience his power, or in order to know him more and more deeply? You see, here's what I want us to catch. If we're like Herod, and spiritually we're searching for God's power in something that isn't him, we're missing the point. We're missing the mark. And so if we're in that place, if we need God's power and we've tried to find it in all these other ways, I just want to invite us to run back to him, to build our trust in our relationship with him, choose him, pursue him, run towards him, not just the things of him, but run actually towards him. The things of him, right? Reading our Bibles, listening to worship music, attending those conferences, all that stuff that's awesome. They can be things that we use to try and control God. They can be things that we use as a replacement for God at times. And so my invitation for us is to continue to lean into God, not just the things of him. Moving ahead in our text, though, we get to what I consider the second and primary act of this story. We move to a different character, Peter, who's currently over here in jail. And again, I'm going to bring our question back to mind. What do you do when you need power? Hold that in your mind as we continue reading, starting in verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. The night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers bound with 2 chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. Then the angel said to him, "Put on your clothes and sandals," and Peter did so. "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me," the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea that what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. They passed the first and second guards and came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them all by itself, and then they went through it. When they had walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know, without a doubt, that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen." When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed, she ran back without opening it and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." "You're out of your mind," they told her. When she kept insisting that it was so, they said, "It must be his angel." But Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. "Tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this," he said, and then he left for another place. In the morning, there was no small commotion among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. After Herod had a thorough search made for him and did not find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed. So Peter's over here in prison. He has not crossed go. He has not collected his $100. He's sitting over there. He's chained up, and the Passover festival is ending, So the next morning, Peter is going to go on trial, and he will be convicted and executed. He is going to follow the same path that James has already had. For Peter, then, this is like the end of the fourth quarter. Everything is on the line. And he needs power now. So what has Peter done? He's gone to sleep. And while Peter's chained up and sound asleep, an angel comes into the prison. He breaks through all the walls, and he even has to wake Peter up. Peter's in such a deep sleep that somehow he doesn't hear the noise and the wrestling and the movement around him. He hasn't noticed God's intervention. He needs the angel to physically tap him and shake him and wake him up. What do you do when you need power? If you or I were in this situation, I think we're probably trying our best to answer this question with something that we can do, right? We might be planning our escape route. Maybe we're walking around shaking the bars, kicking the wall to see if there's any loose places and we can escape that way. Maybe we're crying out to God. We're saying, God, I thought this wouldn't happen. I thought I wouldn't find myself here. Why did you let this happen? Maybe we're even trying to evangelize the guards around us in hopes that if they discover who Jesus is, maybe they'll let us out. Right? All of these options, though, are things that involve us doing something. But Peter doesn't seem to be doing that in this moment. In fact, it doesn't seem like Peter's doing anything. He's asleep. Well, if you're like me, over the last couple of years, you've probably gotten interested in your sleep. There's all sorts of activities and things that we can do to track our sleep now, and there's all sorts of gadgets that help us understand our sleep. And I've gotten a little bit into it over the last couple of years, and there's something in particular I've noticed about my sleeping habits. I'm bad at sleeping. I am not good at sleeping. When I go to bed, it takes me a long time to find the right position that's comfortable, to find the right temperature, to get the blankets just right. It takes me forever to settle down, get comfortable, and fall asleep. And so when I read this particular passage, I'm shocked and I'm impressed. As someone who struggles to fall asleep, how the heck is Peter sleeping in this moment? What the heck, dude? But I think Peter is teaching us something important about his relationship with God. This is the posture of somebody who knows God deeply, who's confident in God. He's trusting that God has a plan for his life, even if he has no idea what that plan looks like. He knows that God is with him and for him. For some of us, we're in a situation right now that may feel like we're in that prison. It might feel like there's no way forward or there's no way out. It doesn't feel like there's a ton of hope. And I want to ask you, how are you responding? Are you scheming? Are you planning? Are you searching? Are you crying? Are you striving? Or are you resting like Peter in the power of the living God? You see, the last few weeks, my prayer as I've been working on this teaching has been, God, teach me to be like Peter in this moment. Teach me to be content and at peace with where you have me. You see, Peter's ability to rest with God in one of the darkest of times is only through God's work in him. If I desire for that to be true about me, I can't just work my way towards that. It's something God's got to keep doing in me. So that's been my prayer. God, make me someone like Peter. What would it look like for you to join me in that prayer? What would it look like to ask God to help you experience the power that comes from his presence? You might be surprised the ways he might answer that. He might bring scripture to mind or bring his word alive in new ways. He might bring community and friends and laughter and joy in places you don't expect it. He might just bring an awareness that he's with you in the times that are hard or difficult or those times that feel like you're in a prison. You see, with God's working in us, we can be people who experience peace in the trials, in the dark times, in the prisons. And while that's great for us individually, this moment with Peter escaping from prison isn't just about each one of us. I think it's teaching us something about the community as well, and the role the community played in letting Peter experience God's power. You see, when Peter was in prison, we read about the group of believers who were praying earnestly for him. The word in the NIV is earnestly. In other translations, it's fervently, but it gives us this idea of straining or striving or sacrifice or really giving ourselves in prayer to something in particular. This group of people, this earnest prayers, they were a praying people, a gathered people. They were a sacrificial and committed people. And that got me wondering if that's what this community was described as. What would this community be described as? How would we describe Fairmount Wesleyan Church? Are we fervent prayers? Are we committed to one another? Are we trusting and expecting for God to be active in us and through us and around us? Because one of the things I caught from this section is Peter's encounter with power, Peter's encounter with God's activity was meant to teach the community something as well. And we see this most clearly when Peter gets to the house of Mary. The people seem really surprised that he's there. We read, the servant girl Rhoda says, "You're out of your mind," they told her. And when she kept insisting that it was so, they said it must be his angel. But Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. There's all sorts of irony and comedy in Peter being able to walk right out of a prison and not walk into his friend's home. But it's almost like this group didn't actually believe that Peter would get out. That they were committed to praying, but they weren't committed to believing that God might actually do something in their community. And I think in that moment, God was reminding this group of people, He isn't only the God who hears prayers. He isn't only the God who invites us to pray. He's also the God who has the power, the authority, and the ability to answer those prayers too. And so I want to challenge us today as we think about this body of believers, this group of us. We need God's power to move in this community. Each one of us has 1 or 5 or 10 or 20 places that we need God to move. And He wants to move through us together. How are we praying? How are we praying for one another? How are we praying together? How are we? Are we earnestly praying? Are we striving together? But then it even goes one step further, I think. I just want to touch on one little thing. We have to believe that God can move too. Right? These people were committed to praying, but then Peter showed up and they're like, oh, you must be his ghost. No, God moved. God did something awesome, and we get to be people who see that and celebrate that and testify to his movement. You see, Peter and this community needed God's power, and they encountered it through praying sacrificially for Peter, praying on behalf of one of their brothers, and by Peter living a life that was open and content before God, whatever the situation seemed. What is it we will do when we need God's power? I want to finish out our chapter moving into the third encounter with power. We're going to go back to King Herod. And if you remember where we left him off in the first spot, he was in a bad place. The people above him were wondering if it was time for him to get a new job. And so he decided he was going to align himself with the Pharisees. He was going to make sure that they were happy so that the people above him were happy too. But unfortunately, with Peter's escape from prison, things have gone from bad to worse for Herod. And he finds himself now in a very awkward position. He needs to do something really quick to regain control, to hold on to the limited power that he has. Starting in verse 19, let's see what he does. Then Herod went from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. He had been quarreling with the people of Tyre and Sidon. They now joined together and sought an audience with him. After securing the support of Blastus, the trusted personal servant of the king, they asked for peace because they depended on the king's country for their food supply. On the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robe, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. They shouted, "This is the voice of a God, not of a man." Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. But the word of God continued to spread and flourish. So when we read this story, it feels like things are happening like boom, 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 one after another. This part of the text is actually probably a year or so after Peter has escaped from prison. We've gone a whole year in just like one verse. And Herod, in this year, he's devised a plan to really cement his authority. And it revolves all around the people of Tyre and Sidon. And what he's decided to do is he's going to cut off their food supply. He's going to do that to show them who the boss is. Because if you control somebody's food supply, you control everything. And so the people of Tyre and Sidon, they've planned this meeting. They've gotten together. They've rallied together as a means to try and see what they can do to get some food back. They're starving. They're hungry. They need to eat. And this is the guy who's making it not happen. The meeting is meant to be a place for Herod then, where his power and his authority is really cemented and explained to all. And so what he does is he brings out all the stops for this meeting. He brings the best clothes, the best robes, and he starts to really address the people. And I imagine, in my mind at least, that he has written this and edited this. This is like his best speech and talking points he's got. So as he's talking to these people, remember, these are the same people that are starving and have no food because of his decisions. They start to say that he is a god. They start to say that he's divine. And as I was studying for this, scholars don't know if this is legit, if they actually think he was divine, or if the people that were saying this were just really hungry and wanted anything for them to get their food back. But it doesn't matter. They're saying he's a god, he's not one of us, he's divine. And then this is what happens. Imagine you're Herod, you hear this. These must have been like the best words to hear, right? Everybody's been questioning if you're good enough, if you're a good leader, if you've got the right amount of power, if you're doing things right. And all of a sudden these people around you start saying, you're not like one of us. You're not human. You must be divine. You must be different. And so he hears this. He takes it in his chest. He starts to maybe rise up and feel stronger and more confident. He takes that glory and power away from God and for himself. And as a result of his selfishness, God allows for him to die. A tragic ending, a disgusting ending, a weird ending for a tragic character. And yet amidst all this chaos and instability and craziness, the word of God is only strengthened. It only moves, it only spreads. People are hearing this message and believing. The message of Jesus Christ isn't stopped or suspended. In fact, it only spread faster. God's power was at work even as Herod was trying to gain power for himself. And I want to ask, I wonder if Herod's scene here, if his final act is an invitation for us, those of us who know Christ, to humility. Herod got to see places where God's activity was at work. He saw Peter escape from jail, and he has no idea how that happened. He saw times that God was moving, and instead of choosing to believe in God, instead of noticing what God was doing around him, he never paid any attention. He never surrendered to the Lord. Instead of confessing that there was a God who maybe had more authority and power and influence than Herod did, he continued to strive and seek and try to control the limited power that he had. And see, I wonder sometimes as Christians if we do that too. I don't think any of us are going to get up and say we're a God or we're divine or something like that. But I think oftentimes we hear things like, you're the only one who listens to me. You're the kindest person. You give the best advice. You're the one I love to talk to. When people say these things, these are usually testaments of God's work in us, not something we've done. And so I want Herod's story to be maybe a graphic reminder for us of the invitation to humility. People can give us compliments. People can say things to us. People can remind us of the work God has done in our life. And sometimes we can take it in and think, wow, I've got my stuff together. I'm really good. But what would it look like for us to give those reminders, give those praises, give the testament of God's work back to him? Because he's the one who's already done the work in us. You see, if we're honest, we need this kind of power constantly, We need God's power every single day. We need him to work in our lives. We need him to work in our families' lives and our friends' lives. We need him to work in this church and in this community and in Grant County and in our world. We see moments of brokenness all the time where we need God's power to come. And it seems in our story that God was invited to move in power when his people fervently prayed and when his people were open and surrendered to him. As I've sat with this text, I've been particularly moved by the reality that when Peter was in prison, the church was moved to prayer. When the future seemed bleak or scary or unknown, when people didn't know what was coming next, their first place to go was to their community and to their God in prayer. I don't know about you, but that's the kind of community I want to be a part of. I want to be a part of a community where fervent prayer describes us. I want to be a part of a community where it's normal for us to come together and ask God to move on our behalf. I want to be a part of a community that we can say, wow, God was here and he did something. And so I've asked this question again and again and again today. What do you do when you need power? Let's not take power like Herod did. Let's live into the example of Peter and the early church of being open before God and being committed to one another in prayer. God's activity seems in some ways in this passage to be moved forward by the prayers of his people. And so let's join ourselves with that. I want to invite the worship team back up as we begin to close our time together. And as we close our service out, this is just an opportunity for us to respond today, to respond to the ways that God has been with us and moving through us. And so here in person, we're going to have a response song. And really, we just want to invite, if you need time to pray, if you need time to pray, or if you want to pray, we're going to open the altar up and let you come down and do that. Part of being a community that prays fervently is choosing to be in places where we can pray with and pray for one another. And so we want to open up the altar. I know it's a little bit squished, but we'll make space if you want to come down. So if you've got a request that you need, come down to the altar. Our community would love to gather around you and pray. But also, if you just want to recommit to being a person who will fervently pray, we also just want to have you come down to the altar because that matters too. That's important too. That affects this church too. For those of you online, you're going to get a guided video with kind of the same opportunity for you to pray in our video time as well. So take that time. It's yours. So as we close, as we begin our time in worship, take this time. It's yours. Continue to be with God and be open to the ways that he wants to be with us.